Two Guys, One Shaker Cup podcast, hosted by Joshua Shaw and Ryan Buckeye.
What's going on, boys and girls, children of all ages? Josh Shaw, Ryan Buckeye here. Two Guys, One Shaker Cup podcast, back better than ever. Josh is wearing a fancy hat today. Josh, do you realize that your hat has a red snap band on it?
Yeah. I mean, we are moving up in this world. I made a few extra dollars this month, so then I decided to just, upgrade this part here. I'm not going full difference on the hat, but maybe if we continue to do a good job here, maybe I'll be able to do that. Maybe 2022. I don't know.
Two other observations, Josh. One, V-neck. You're finally is this the deep V that we're going with?
Yeah, this is the prototype. For those that have been following our channel for a while, they know we have gotten some people asking if we're going to actually make some type of swag. And Ryan jokingly said V-neck. So I decided to bare the chest a little bit here on one of these prototypes. You never know. It could happen. Again, I'm already trying out hats. I'm trying out shirts. I mean, we're going on a full brand experience here with our podcast. This is no longer just you and I bullshitting. This is going to become a brand. Watch out, Nike. Watch out, Under Armour. We're coming for you.
This will always be you and I just bullshitting. That's true. The third observation, Josh, is why do you do your hair in a nice comb over if you're going to wear a hat? I don't get it.
You're not the first person that's ever asked me that question. And I actually was thinking about this because the other day I was watching your Instagram stories and you had only a few things that were spiking out of your hair, of your hat. And I thought, doesn't that annoy him? Because if he just put a little bit of product or wet in his hair, then he wouldn't have to worry about that, because I don't like when that happens. And honestly, why I started to do this is my hair was a little bit longer, maybe a couple of years ago. And it actually, when it would fall, it would tickle my eyebrows and eyelashes. I didn't like it. So then I basically started to do that because I just didn't want it in my eyes. Now it's probably just habit because I'm OCD and that's just what I do.
Candidly, I was hungover in that IG story. So spent the weekend in South Beach. I couldn't help it. So that's why I didn't give a shit what my hair looked like. Hangover effect. Again, these transitions are just on money. But Josh and I want to talk about today. Listen, the sports nutrition industry has a nice history to it, a really good history to it. And what Josh and I thought would be fun is we had an episode before. If you could be CEO of a supplement brand one day, what brand would that be, and what would be your first day in office look like? Josh tossed out the ideas what company, a blast from the past that could still be in existence today, or might be out of business, would you want to basically go back to and take over, and then potentially what would you do differently? And I think there is a lot of options here for us, and there are a lot of cool brands. And I told Josh, jokingly before the show, I said, I guarantee you're going to pick EAS. And he told me no. So if it's not EAS, Joshua, what legacy brand that may or may not be in existence today would Josh Shaw be at the be at the helm of this business?
So I'm gonna continue to poke the bear here, and I'm gonna pick a Glanbia business.
Of course you
because why not?
Yeah.
So I'm gonna go with BSN.
Okay.
Because for me, as a consumer, and I've mentioned this on my channel a few times, is that as a consumer, that was my first brand that I actually enjoyed and got affected by from the sports nutrition world, because the first pre-workout that I consumed was NO Explode in college, and then it was kind of they had cool athletes, they had cool packaging, they had all this kind of things working for them. As a college kid, I was enamored by it. I was this is awesome. And that kind of transitioned over these last, maybe 15 or so years from college days to now, has kind of affected me in a certain way. I think just because anytime you find a brand relatively early and you get interested in it and you become a fan of it, and then you see it what it is today and it's not what it was, you get a little bit sad. You're this should have been something different. This should have had a different story. So that's kind of why I'm picking BSN, just because I think I personally had been a fan of it. I liked the products. I liked just everything the brand was doing back in those mid 2000s, late 2000s, and then for whatever reason, now we're in 2020. You barely see anything from them.
Yeah, I was gonna just say, I was gonna go out there and tell people they still exist. BSN is still in business today could fool quite a few people because you don't see a whole lot about them. But BSN is interesting, and I'm sure you're going to dive into it and what you might do. But with BSN being part of the Glambia family of brands, they have a predicament there in terms of how do they differentiate that brand from like your Optums, and that would be something obviously you would. Now the question is like, would you run BSN prior to the acquisition from Glambia, or would it be when they're part of the Glambia family? Because I think that then too determines kind of like what strategy you're going to implement. Because obviously BSN did something right to be acquired by this big fucking company in Glambia, but then when Glambia acquired BSN, they didn't know what to do with it, and I think that's why today you're like, okay, Syntha 6, No Explode, those used to be super popular. Like they owned the color red. The color red was BSN. Nobody touched it. Now you can have a company come out with red, and people will be like, "Oh my god, this is a cool new company." Somebody else can own red now. They allowed red to kind of go away from the wayside.
Yeah.
For me, sticking on I guess this whole subject of red, like mine's metrics. I think, like I know that they are still, I think, in existence today.
Yeah.
Very similar to BSN, but like not a whole hell of a lot going for them. Once upon a time, they sponsored some of the biggest bodybuilders in the business. I mean, they were having massive booths at these events. I mean, they still they have some really good protein bars, things like that. But I mean, they had a cool brand, and Metrics was one of the first brands back in the day to really sort of catapult the sports nutrition industry forward by coming out with some cool stuff, and then gone. Like, I mean, not for real gone, but like gone to the point where you walk into a GNC or a vitamin shop, I don't even know if you find it on their shelves anymore.
No, I don't think you do. I mean, you're going to find them at like C stores, their bars, or something like that. That's basically what they've become now. It's basically some of those like Big 100 or the Colossal bars or whatever. I mean,
those are delicious. Those are delicious.
Yeah, they're still great. I mean, it's still stuck in the past. Those bars are stuck in the past from like years and years and years and years ago. Like they haven't decided to upgrade any of them. They still do, good because I think they work for like the mainstream buyer that walks into a Sheetz or a 7-Eleven or, something like that. But in our world, if they tried to sell that at a GNC, somebody would be like, man, there's so many other like better options, better composed, ready to eat options now that I don't need to consume 50 grams of sugar or whatever was in those bars. That's why they taste so good. I mean, I still probably would love to eat a lot of those. So if Metrics is listening to this, send me and Ryan a couple boxes of those things because we still want to eat them. Yeah. Not you because you're on prep right now, but I'll consume enough for both of us.
I don't know a single person that works with them. And we know a lot of people, Josh. Between Josh and I, we know a lot of people that work for these companies. And if you go to Metrics today, their website today, completely different look than what it once was. I mean, except for some of their old like standard stuff, but like apparently they have performance powders. They have an RTD still. They have a protein powder. Could have fooled me. I guess they don't even have a pre-workout. They just have, maybe they do. Yeah, they have a pre-workout that nobody in the world could tell you about. I mean, I couldn't tell you about it. Never heard of it until now. And when you talk like BSNs, I'm interested, Josh, from your perspective, because you deal with strategy all day, every day. That's what people pay you a lot of money to do. It's like, how do we develop a strategy to win in this market? And you look at BSN, and you look at your sister companies in Optum, and even like Isopure to an extent. What's one of the first things that you're going to do?
Yeah, you asked the question at the beginning, like, would I want to run this like pre-Glambia or post-Glambia? And I probably want to run it post-Glambia, mostly because I have so many resources available. Right. And it's unfortunate that they didn't use those resources in the kind of the proper way back in the day. I mean, if we're going back to, I think when it was acquired in like 2000, maybe 11, I remember looking recently, and I think I put out an article around just like what was the strategic plans for BSN when they did purchase it. And out of the 5 that they put out there, they pretty much did what they said. I mean, a lot of it was around like taking this and creating scale and putting this out more. Like the first couple of years that BSN was in the Glambia Performance Nutrition's portfolio, like things were great in terms of like growth and that nature because they were able to be put kind of everywhere really quick because of the scale of Glambia, but they kind of eroded what they were, their DNA. They everything that was cool about them, everything that was unique about them over the years became turned into like what Optimum is. Like Optimum, is a very high quality, economical, line.
Right.
It's a sports nutrition line that has really great quality products that you can, as any level that you want of a consumer, you can pick up a product there and you're going to get a experience that is good. It's great. You know what I mean? Like it's consistent. It's priced accordingly. You're basically getting product from the cow. So everything is about as good as you're going to get in terms of that. So they had that company already there. And then you have BSN that unfortunately just kind of like slowly got closer and closer and closer and closer to Optimum, where then now if you look at it, it's hard for you to decide which one is which. Like if you were to take away the red containers, which now they've muted and they've, changed the labels and they've changed things to like really like play that down, and you swapped it around and we had to like only look at basic non-labeled product, we would have trouble trying to figure out who's who. Yeah. Between the two, because they've kind of taken everything to the same level, I guess. And now if we're looking at this through a hindsight type of thing, and now they have all these other brands in their portfolio, they look extremely close to each other, comparable to some of their other products in their portfolio. And that didn't happen overnight. It took a while for like the sports nutrition category to like get to this point where they became similar to each other. I mean, Glanbia did some things that brought them close, but also just the market in general, like started to make these products become a little bit closer in the minds of consumers. So first, step is to really just like rip it down to nothing and then figure out like, how do we differentiate this from everything else in our portfolio? Because we don't want this to cannibalize everything else. And that's the problem right now. Consumers are struggling to figure out like, what should I buy? Why don't I just buy Optimum? Why do I buy BSN? There's really nothing that is driving them to be different.
At all, really. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think that's, if you speak to people at Glanbia today, they'll tell you that same thing. Like our biggest challenge is to differentiate these two brands from one another because one's cannibalizing the other and vice versa. If I told people on this podcast, like you have Gold Standard Whey protein next to Synthesis 6, they are different proteins for the record. They're different. That's in the name. But like, would you know the difference? And most people would be probably like not so much. But their product offering across both brands are similar. I think like BSN just they had the pre-workout market, like it was theirs. Yeah. Like it was theirs, and then this little company called USP Labs came along with a thing called Jack 3D, and it killed their market share. So like that would be interesting. Maybe we'll have you discuss that in a second, Josh, on if you go back to that era, like what would you do when it comes to the pre-workout? Because I think No Explode was one of the best selling. It was the best selling pre-workout I think for a long time. And then this little company came across and it's like blew it up. For metrics, for me, it's like, okay, I mean, it's a nostalgia brand today. Like but the thing is, like, people within the industry know metrics. People outside the industry, no clue at all. Yeah. People outside the industry probably don't know BSN very much, but they may know Optum from your casual visit to Costco's or whatever it might be. But it's like, okay, metrics had a product portfolio of like protein, Size Up, I believe it was called. They had commodities like, I don't know, they probably had like glutamine, creatine, things like that, aminos. And then they had the big colossal bars, which they got into C-stores. But outside of that, they got stagnant and they stopped and they didn't do a whole lot. They had all this money they spent on bodybuilders and athletes, realized that there was no return on investment there. And I'm sure they spent a ton of money on magazine ads. And at some point, all these other companies were coming out after Metrics and EAS and Weider Sports and all these companies were making the sports nutrition industry big and large and attractive. Then you had all these new brands come out, like the BSNs of the world and like the Gasparis of the world, and create products that were a lot more exciting, a lot more effective. Some of them more cost effective than what was out there. Well, Metrics just sat back and waited, and they didn't do a whole hell of a lot. And I think complacency can be one of the most scary things in anything, whether it be business, in your personal life. Like when you become complacent because you think you've accomplished all you need to accomplish and that your brand is just big enough to sell itself, you're going to fuck yourself. And I mean, you have to adapt with the times. Now, that's not to say like they had to come out with, I don't know. I mean, I always look at like Blockbuster and how Blockbuster decided not to adapt and Netflix kind of surpassed them. There wasn't anything necessarily per se like Netflix coming into our space. Like a protein powder from 20 years ago is still a protein powder today. It just tastes better and it's probably higher quality whey protein. But you had these brands doing things like your USP Labs, with these microdosing pre-workouts, and you had different flavoring of protein. I think that's a big thing too, because protein was a huge seller for Metrics. And I don't think they improved their flavors in 10 years for the most part. So it's just, the complacency thing would be the thing. Like, you have to go in there and inject, whether it be innovation or inject energy into the brand and say, listen, for us to stay alive, we need to be on top and we need to stay hungry. And I think a good example of that in today's world is you look at a company like Cellucor lately. I mean, coming out with new transparent labels, coming out with like a 10-year anniversary of their pre-workout. Like, they are staying fresh and relative in the market when they've been the number one selling pre-workout forever. Like, they're sitting on top, and for the most part, people who know C4 knows, in terms of the sports nutrition world, knows it's not a fantastic pre-workout in terms of effectiveness, but it sure makes that company a lot of money. And they don't have to come out with these super epic packed formulas that cost $70, but they did because they want to stay fresh, they want to stay exciting, they want to stay cool. Another brand, Muscle Tech the same way. I mean, they've had their issues in the past. They have every, quote unquote, right to kind of just put their feet up and become complacent, but they are still out there trying to stay on top of the innovation curve. And the reason being is, like, you have these small companies out there coming out with some really cool stuff, and the power of the internet has really connected us with more brands than ever before. To stay fresh and exciting, you have to continually innovate. And the day you become complacent is essentially the day you can die. And I think that's what happened with Metrics. Now, granted, Metrics is still there, but I bet you anybody listening, I mean, if there's somebody listening to this podcast that is brand loyal to Metrics, please leave us a comment, or brand loyal to BSN. I can't imagine many people are brand loyal to either of the brands that you and I picked.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I mean, and you made a comment in terms of, like, just evolving and not being complacent. And I think that obviously, depending on the year in which we are operating the business, our plan of action would be much different, because if we're looking at this through the lens of 2020, the things that we would have to do are much different than maybe when this company or the companies we picked started to fall. Like, it might be a little bit different in that idea. So, like, 2020, we might be like, oh, we'd have to completely overhaul a bunch of things. But, like, there was things that happened, like, incrementally, that eroded at both of the brands that we're talking about. And there's also, like, the idea of life cycles. We don't necessarily, like, a brand cannot sustain, like, hyper growth and differentiation and innovation and all these kind of things for the longest time. Eventually they become, in a further life cycle, a more mature company. They need to be in, convenience stores. They need to be in grocery stores. They need to be at Walmart. They need to do those things and that's what life cycle they're in. A good example of this is like Cellucor. I mean, like, a lot of their sales, comes through channels that are no longer specialty. And that's, a reality of their business. That could have been a reality of the business with BSN. Like, why is NO Explode not C4, like original C4? And now you also can play off of that and, innovate and be edgy and still do some cool things. But, like, your life cycle is, you're probably a lot later in terms of your cycle. You're in your mature stage, and you're just cashing off of a lot of that brand equity that you built, those product equity names. Like, NO Explode, they've eroded that completely. Like, that doesn't mean anything to anybody. Like, somebody going into Walmart, they're not necessarily knowing anything about NO Explode, and they should, because that was C4. I mean, that should have been C4. There's no reason why that shouldn't be C4 in the same cycle of its life cycle right now. Like, it should be at selling hundreds of millions of dollars at channels that are outside of specialty. But unfortunately, it's not. They're trying now to, like, compete again into specialty. And how do you do that? How do you reinvent the brand? You need to go back probably then to your roots, and that's a completely different kind of conversation. Is like, go back to that edgy, innovative phase of your thing. Basically, remake the whole thing, but go back to the core of what it used to be. And I think that why I mentioned around, like, wanting to be a part of Glanbia's performance, just the company as a whole, is that, like, I have every resource to go back to that. I have innovation houses, I have ingredients, I have everything at my fingertips to create the most edgy, innovative brand that I can, to the limits of what Glanbia would be allowed from a publicly traded company. But, like, I could create something that is super unique out there, and I can have it priced almost to the point of cheaper than anybody else's stuff out there, because I own the whole kind of thing. We talked about this when we did, like, the CEO thing, is like,
right,
if they just connected A to Z from Glanbia, like, the cows to the end consumer, they can beat any single company out there outside of like, if somebody like a Mondelez or something like one of these big companies goes out and buys some of these sports nutrition brands, like from a full scale, from the supply chain to the consumer, Glanbia owns everything. So like you don't technically have to pay all those like 30-40% here, 30-40, everybody's making money through the supply chain when you're talking about even like a Metrics. You got to pay the contract manufacturer, has to pay the supplier, like the brand has to pay the contract manufacturer, the contract manufacturer has to pay, like there's this whole like thing where everybody's making a little bit of money here, where I'm basically getting the stuff from the source, and I don't need to like build in all these big margins the whole way through, because I'm gonna hopefully make a product, the edgiest product out there, for $3, and I'm going to be able to sell it for $39. Nobody else can do that. They're going to make a product for the same product I can make for $3. They can make it for 15, and I beat them all day long. So it's for whatever reason, I don't know if it's like the massiveness of the company has like taken them away from being able to connect all those dots or whatever. But like a lot of what I'm kind of thinking about is that you want to be a part of it, but you also need to have the autonomy to actually make it happen to the level that you would need it to happen. If not, you're probably better off just being independent and running your own show.
Yeah, it's funny too with BSN. You're right. Like if you go back to the roots, they were innovative. They were cool. I mean, BSN was cool, and BSN recently did a collaboration effort licensing deal with Cold Stone Ice Cream. And I didn't feel it was that cool. Like, I mean, the coolness factor had been lost in the brand. That license deal with somebody else would have been much better potentially. But like, then again, too, BSN was kind of this like failing ship or sinking ship, and Cold Stone too, kind of not as popular as it once was either. So you sort of partnered with a brand that's in a similar position to what BSN was, and it's like that. I get it. I get the licensing stuff. It could have been cool, but it wasn't cool. And I think with Metrics too, like that's the thing. Like Metrics for the most part, because of who they sponsored, whether it be, Flex Lewis and some of these bigger name athletes, like they were a hardcore kind of brand. Yeah. Very
even like you think like even like the strongmen, like they were doing the Metrics Strongest Man for like that was it. Like it's kind of like the Reebok CrossFit Games, like you just put those brands together now, and like for whatever reason, like that fell off. The whole Metrics World's Strongest Man. I remember watching that as a kid, like just enamored by these big dudes lifting stones and thinking like, man, this is awesome.
Yeah, like and Metrics' big thing was protein. I talked about that before. And it's like when you stop innovative in that, and other people surpass you in flavors, and they're just like, wait a second, I can get this other thing that has similar ingredients, probably better ingredients, and taste better. They're going to do that, and they just never change. And I think they lost their cool edge factor as well because they became complacent and stagnant, and they'd have to go back to the drawing table and say, how do I innovate to stay on top of the curve? Now, in the world of digital media, they might have been better off. I don't know. I mean, in terms of maybe having the right people in place to create campaigns that made them seem cooler, but like they stuck to a lane and they didn't deviate from it. They didn't adapt with the times, and ultimately that for me was their biggest downfall. And again, I'm not saying that their products are bad. I'm not saying anything along those lines. I'm just saying whoever was in charge there, just let it go. And they didn't invest into marketing. They didn't invest in the product improvement. They probably didn't invest into their number one asset, which is employees. They probably didn't get the right people in place. Because if they did, I don't think that's the thing too. Like the biggest strategy change you make as CEO, and anytime you take over a company that's been failing, you probably just don't have the right people in place. You don't have the right people that sees what's going on to change it. So, like, if you're going to invest all this money into marketing or into package design or formulations, but you have the same people in place, you ultimately might end up back where you were. So, like, as CEO, and you get into a company, and we didn't really talk about that in the last episode. But then again, the companies we picked necessarily weren't really in bad places; they were doing well. But these companies both have been quote, not failing, but just downward spiral. Yeah. So whether it's the CEO of these current companies or the people, the brand manager at BSN, and again, nothing against the brand manager at BSN or Glanbia, I don't know who they are or what. And again, in those situations too, when you work for a large company like Glanbia, even though you're the brand manager, you still have a lot of red tape. You can't just make changes on the regs. So it's not necessarily the fault of that, but then in that case, it might be the policies and procedures that are in place on that brand that you would change. So those are the two kind of brands that we would look at. I mean, do you think, Josh? I mean, when you look at BSN now, you know the owners of Glanbia a little bit too, as do I. We both know that they're working hard to try to differentiate BSN from Optum. Do you think that they're going to be able to do that effectively to the point where BSN can start maybe gaining some market share again?
I mean, and obviously I'm only looking at this from like the outside in, I don't necessarily see anything to the aggressiveness that would be needed. I think a lot of where their strategies are going from like their product, more ready to eat, ready to drink, their sales channels, a lot of the things that they talk about constantly from like high level strategy are not necessarily meeting or like kind of aligning with BSN right now. Now they might have some things in the works that we just don't know about, but just seeing what they currently have and where I know Glanbia is trying to go with some of their immediate consumption products and things of that nature, like they're going to need to make a complete 180 on that brand. And the interesting thing about it is that like they actually like the BSN brand like had both ready to eat and ready to drink things for a long time. They were actually pretty early, like for the level in which the innovation was for their products. Like they were too early that people were not really like the consumer set wasn't there enough to support those products. So it's interesting that like all those years ago, back 10 years at this point, they had, the Synthesix RTD that was with the UFC and they were doing all this kind of stuff with it. And then for whatever reason, you fast forward 10 years, the share of the market dollars going towards RTDs are much bigger than what it is now. But they were too early. Now it's kind of like, what do you do? Because you have to go back to that world, but like that's not reinventing the wheel. That's like going back to like the core. So I don't know if that like invigorates everybody, because if you are a 21-year-old kid that was 11 when the last time BSN was cool, this is a whole new brand to you. You have no idea. You have no idea the legacy of BSN. You have no idea what they were all about back in the early or late 2000s. You have no idea. So like, for you to go into the brand and get some products that were like, cool 10 years ago, that wouldn't be, you wouldn't be interested in that, because there's so many other opportunities out there for you. Like there's 10,000 brands that probably speak to you on a much different level, a much closer level. So I don't know. I mean, I never like write anything off. Like I'm the notorious like positive person, like with these companies as assets, because I just think about it as like, I frame it the right way. Like a win today is not the win that it was going to be in 2011 or whatever. Like for you to get back up to $100 million of good business is probably would be your win. You wouldn't be trying to go after $400 or $500 million. So I still think there's like a lot of value in BSN. I just think that right now I don't really see the movements that's going to get them back to that. I'm sure there's a lot of like smart, hardworking people that are trying to make that happen. But to your point, there's probably a lot of bureaucracy and red tape and all kinds of things that people are beating against them, saying, hey, we don't want to overinvest in this. We'd rather just extract value over going back and investing in this brand. So when I talked about this the last time in my own channel, I talked about the kind of leaving the question of like, is it better for them to divest the brand right now? Is it better off just get what you can get out of it, sell it off to somebody else, and let somebody else like really like put the money into it to do it without all the red tape and bureaucracy and everything, like just a straight line to CEO to the creatives and just roll with it and see what happens. So I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I definitely keep following along because I go back to my original comments. I was a fan of the brand. I was a customer of the brand. I bought a lot of product from them over the years, and I still enjoy it. I still look at them and say, what can you be? You could be something great. It's just a matter of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in terms of like my personal thoughts is like dissolve the brand or sell it off. I think at this point, because you already have Optum, unless you're going to completely do a 180 to your point and change the brand. But then when you change the brand to a complete 180, you're basically a brand new brand. And then it's like you still have the legacy of BSN that still lingers and kind of overshadows what you're trying to accomplish. And that's the biggest thing with like metrics for me. It's like you have the legacy of the brand there. But now they have things like snack cups, Josh, like these different and pancake mixes and stuff. Not saying it's wrong, but it's not what the brand was about. And I think now they're like all of a sudden, 10 years later, like, okay, what can we do? Let's just change the brand completely. Let's change the branding. The branding's not that attractive. It's pretty generic. I think Metrics is dead. I mean, they're still there, but I mean, if it wasn't for their bars, like I think they would be hurting. And the only reason is the bars, they still sell really well, I think, in C-stores. I mean, they're there. People try one. They're like, oh my God, this is delicious. Well, it's because it's basically a candy bar with a ton of calories. But it's just one of those brands that I think has cool legacy. And I'm a historian of the industry. The other one I was going to pick would be Weider Sports. I think when they came out with, like, Weider was the first Creation I ever took as a kid. I was like 16 years old. I mean, they really helped create this entire category. And like even EAS to an extent, like we talked about earlier before the show, was they were there in the beginnings. And it's sometimes you look at some of these brands that were massive, that no longer exist today, or that may be on the verge of dying today. And generally the theme is the same. They got complacent. It's typically not that they made a wrong strategic choice, because I guess you could say the strategic choice was to be complacent and not change, and that's a bad choice. But most of these big brands that fail for very similar reasons. And I feel like if people kind of took a look at the bigger picture and said, okay, why did Metrics, why is BSN, why are these other brands that used to own this industry, EAS, why are they gone? Why is that? And there's a common theme there. And I think, like, we could do a case study, Josh, and I bet you the commonalities are very similar. And I bet you the commonalities come back to one thing, and that's the people. I mean, the people that were in charge just they didn't care anymore, or they had a different agenda in terms of what was supposed to happen. So I love this episode. It's kind of walked down memory lane a little bit, and we'd love to hear from you guys out there too. I'm sure there's people that have been in the industry for 25 years. They're like, oh my God, you've got to talk about this brand, that brand. Yeah, there's so many brands that used to be really big and prevalent that have died. And now you see a brand like Ghost and Redcon. Both these brands, for instance, I know we talk about them a lot on here. Redcon is 4 years old. Ghost is 3.5 years old, or whatever it is. Or 4 years old. Like, they're both super young brands, less than 5 years. They're two of the biggest brands in the industry in terms of, now they're not as big as Optum, they're not as big as Cellucor, but they're massive. I mean, Redcon's an $90 million brand. Ghost is probably north of 50 million, whatever it might be. That number is private, but they did it quickly because they're innovative, they're creative, and they're changing all the time. They didn't get to, Aaron Singerman is not going to get to 100 million and stop. He's going to sell, or he's going to keep being aggressive. I mean, that's the mindset of him. Dan Ryan the same way. I mean, obviously not about to leave other brands, but there are a lot of brands out there that complacency scares the shit out of them, and I think that's what makes them great.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anybody enjoyed this episode, like, just because we took a little bit more of a historical route here, I would suggest watching a documentary, Sups the movie. Both of us, Alex Ardenti, it's on, I think, Amazon Prime Video, or I think Vimeo. You can watch it as well. I don't know if it's moved over to like free yet, or if it's still paid.
Paid, $14.99, I think it is.
Yeah, but it's a great documentary, especially if you are into this world, like sports nutrition, and you're a historian and you just like to see where everything started. He doesn't move up to the level and where we're talking, like we usually are talking more like contemporary, the last probably 5 to 7 years. And when we talk about things, when we bring up references and things like that, because we want to have the people that are listening to us actually be able to draw back on that experience, because usually then we're in college or high school or whatever it is. But Alex's movie is very much like, before even you and I were born. So you can learn about a lot of brands, a lot of like things that you just didn't know about at all. You're just like, wow, this is where this all stems from. This is where you could see some lineages to like where what we're talking about today. And you're like, wow, this is why it happened the way it happened,
Yeah. And plus Fitness Informant makes the documentary. So, I mean, if you haven't watched it, check it out. Yeah. Cheap plug for myself on that. But if you like this episode, otherwise subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, over at YouTube, Two Guys, One Shaker Cup on Facebook, Josh Shaw Consulting, Fitness Informant. We'd love to hear some topics, love to hear some feedback on this show. I feel like we're going to get quite a few feedback on this one, so it should be good. Josh, when you're atop the helm at Columbia, remember us little guys, okay? I mean, I'll scrub toilets and mop the floor as long as you pay me 6 figures. So that's my offer to you.